Hi everyone, here's my critical appraisal of the article that we have for this week by Austin, Shanahan, and Zavara on association of childhood abuse and prescription opioid use in early adulthood. So you have on the left a copy of the article and on the right my worksheet. And you see that I've categorized this study as one about constructs and categories, rates and trends, and associations. It's about associations because it says that right in the title, a clear tip-off. And if it's about associations, it has to cover the previous two topics, rates and trends and constructs. So, what is the purpose of the study? Well, I took this right from the abstract, the part you see highlighted on the left. The aim was to examine the association of childhood emotional, physical, and sexual abuse with prescription opioid use in early adulthood. Are the key constructs clearly explained? I said yes. And I'm looking here at the section on measures when they described these constructs. Here I note that the main constructs are childhood abuse and opioid use. And on the right, I suggest that childhood abuse is operationally defined as answers to specific questions, so it's self-reported. And the questions are described pretty clearly in the article itself. So for example, emotional abuse, it says, was assessed with the question, how often did a parent or other adult caregiver say things that really hurt your feelings or made you feel like you were not wanted or loved? And I think that questions can be raised about that definition of emotional abuse. I think it's kind of wide open and maybe subject to misunderstanding. So I'm just wondering how many young adults would say that a parent or other caregiver really hurt their feelings once. Maybe quite a few. The other questions seem a little more straightforward to me. Physical abuse is assessed with the question, how often did a parent or adult caregiver hit you with a fist, kick you or throw you down the floor, into a wall, or downstairs? I think that's more clearly physical abuse. Okay, and sex abuse assessed with the question, how often did a parent or other adult caregiver touch you in a sexual way, force you to touch him or her in a sexual way, or force you to have sexual relations? Again, a clear and I think appropriate definition of this construct. Notice that each of these questions is asked in terms of how often this happened. And I'm thinking that the researchers did that to make it easier for kids to say once or twice or however many times, rather than saying, yes, this happened, or no, it didn't. But also I'll notice that none of these abuse questions includes the possibility that the young person was abused by somebody other than a caregiver. So if the abuse was perpetrated by a relative who was not a caregiver or another teenager who was not a caregiver, that might not show up in the data here. Okay, regarding opioid use, again, I think the definition is clear. They do tell us exactly how they measured it. And so they say here in section 2.2.2 that interviewers were instructed to ask the respondent to present the medications that they took, if they were easily available, or, and in that case, the interviewer would record the medication name, or the respondent was asked to list any prescription meds taken in the last 4 weeks. Okay, that's clear to me. I'm not entirely clear how they got access to medications in the respondent's home. Did they ask to be shown the medicine cabinet? That's a little unusual. And because there are a couple of possible ways that people could respond, I do wish the researchers had recorded for each case how this response was gathered. That is, was the response based on a visual inspection of the meds or on self-report? And I wish that they had done that, because I think that self-reported medication use is not particularly reliable, and visual inspection of medications has absolutely unknown reliability. Okay, on to the PICO. So the population, or problem of interest, the population is young adults, ages 24 to 32. That's their age at the most recent wave of this longitudinal study. And these are young adults in the US. The independent variable, or variables, are emotional, physical, and or sexual abuse that occurred before the age of 18. And the relevant comparisons are comparisons of adults who are abused or not, or actually the way they've presented the data here, they're comparing people who used or did not use opioids and looking back at history of childhood abuse. So the outcomes of prescription opioid use in the last 4 weeks. Are the key constructs grounded in theory or empirical observation? Yes, they're grounded in observation. Theory is less clear. For structured measures, which is what we have here, is the level of measurement appropriate for the construct? That's not clear to me, in part because I think that questions can be raised about the frequency and severity of childhood abuse and of opioid use. And those issues aren't really captured here. They did collect data on the frequency of childhood abuse, but then they dichotomized it. So they say here on page 266, they dichotomized each type of abuse as occurring one or more times or as never occurring. And by doing that, I think they lost some valuable information. So I'm not sure that was a good thing to do. Practically, it might have been easier. And then the next question, is there evidence of reliability? No. Is there evidence of validity? No. I don't see that mentioned in this article. That's unfortunate. And what study design elements are used? Okay, they used 2 waves of a national longitudinal study. They got data from participants at age 12 to 18, that was wave 1, and ages 24 to 32, wave 4. They used multivariate analysis to control for differences in sex, race, ethnicity, age, and socioeconomic status. Now, I don't expect you to understand the details of that analysis, but know that this kind of statistical analysis for other differences is useful in this situation. Is the study design appropriate for the central question or hypothesis? Yes, I think so. Not ideal, certainly, but it's absolutely appropriate. Rates and trends. Okay, is it clear what the data points represent? Yes, in terms of the points in time, we have a longitudinal study and they're saying very clearly when the data were collected. What is being counted? Well, they're counting the people who reported emotional, physical, sexual abuse in childhood and recent opioid use. Proportions are used, and the numerators are the number of people who report each situation, either emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse in childhood, and or recent opioid use. And the denominator for all of these proportions is the valid number of people who answered the questions, specific questions about type of abuse or type of or opioid use. Percentage change is not reported, it's not applicable. Are you confident in the accuracy of the data? Well, I said no. I wanted a little more information here. I was really curious about their measures of childhood abuse, and I was looking to see what proportions of the sample reported emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, and I didn't see that. I think they should have given us that. But I found that it was actually pretty easy to recreate from this data. So, being a geek, I created a little spreadsheet. And I took the data straight out of this table 1 on page 267, where they report the numbers of people who said they had been emotionally abused, physically abused, sexually abused. But they did this for subgroups. They did this for people who also reported opioid use and for people who did not report opioid use. So by adding those 2 columns together, I could get the total number of people who reported emotional abuse. So you see that in the first, now this is a contingency table, 2x2 contingency table in my spreadsheet. So I've just basically recreated the raw numbers from their table. So the number of people who said yes, they were emotionally abused and also used opioids was 404. I add that to the people who were emotionally abused but did not use opioids, 6,517, and I get a total number of people who reported emotional abuse. I add that total and the total of people who said they were not emotionally abused to get a total, now I call this valid N, the number of people who answered both questions, that is the question about emotional abuse and the question about opioid use. That's the valid number of cases for this analysis. And then I find by taking the total number of people who reported emotional abuse, dividing it by the total valid N, I get the proportion. So 47% of this sample reported emotional abuse. Wow, that's high. And that confirms my concern about that question, that if somebody said yes once my parent really hurt my feelings, they would be considered emotionally abused. So now I'm really concerned about that variable. People who answered yes to physical abuse make up 19% of the sample. Wow, that's high. But that, I say that as a child welfare researcher, that seems like a high proportion. If it was people, if the question had included hitting or any kind of corporal punishment, this result would not surprise me, but it doesn't include that. It includes questions that are clearly, in my mind, physical abuse. So that's pretty stunning, 19%. The proportion that reports sex abuse, 5%, that's really consistent with our other population data. So that looks entirely reasonable. And then the total that report any abuse, well, I think that's really inflated by the way that emotional abuse is defined. Okay, so now I have a better sense of what's going on with the abuse reports. Let me get out of that and get back to these questions. See, if graphs are used, are the scales or axes meaningful? It's just not applicable. Are relevant observations included, not omitted? I'm not sure. The authors say that they are concerned that some people didn't respond to wave 4. They're missing some data there. They're thinking of that as a possible problem. But I think we may have some omitted data on opioid use and on childhood abuse. It's just not clear. These are difficult things to ask people about, difficult at best. Are the comparisons fair? Again, I'm not sure. Comparing people who said they were emotionally abused to those who said they weren't emotionally abused, I'm not sure that that's a clean comparison. And again, there are problems with dichotomizing people's responses to those abuse questions. I would like to have seen those left as counts or interval level data and to look at associations between those counts and the opioid use variable. Is uncertainty relevant? Yes, almost always it's relevant. And is it adequately addressed with confidence intervals? Yes, they do a pretty nice job of using confidence intervals throughout. On to the associations. Are the associations analyzed in appropriate ways given the level of measurement of the variables? Well, given that they were using dichotomous measures, yes, they did that appropriately using odds ratios for dichotomous data. Does the study have the sensitivity or statistical power needed to detect associations or differences? Yes, this is a huge sample. Is the sample size sufficient? Yes, almost 15,000 people. If graphs are used, that's not applicable. What are the size of the effects? What are the effect sizes of the associations? Well, they report effect sizes, that is odds ratios, of 1.4 to 1.6. Yes, that's meaningful. That means that the people who reported prescription opioid use had much greater odds of reporting emotional abuse or physical abuse in childhood. The odds increased by 0.4 or 0.6. That's meaningful. And except that they found no relationship with sex abuse, so the odds ratios there are really quite small. They're not statistically significant, meaning that they don't detect a relationship between childhood sex abuse and opioid use. Possibly because the numbers of people who reported sex abuse are small. Could other variables account for these associations? Yes, and the authors mention some. They note that parent mental health and parent substance abuse could be confounders, meaning they could be other explanations for the relationship between childhood abuse and opioid use. In other words, it could be that both of the variables that they're looking at, childhood abuse and early adult opioid use, are caused by that person's parents' mental health or substance use. And they don't have data on that. Is uncertainty relevant? Yes, and again, they do deal with this with confidence intervals. Now, I went ahead and answered the questions about prediction. The authors don't claim to be predicting anything, but you could raise questions about whether prediction is reasonable to infer from this study. So I went ahead and did this. Has time order been clearly established? Well, that's unclear to me. The retrospective reports were obtained around the same time that the opioid uses reports were gathered. And in any case, the retrospective reports were done years after, in most cases, the abuse would have happened. So I'm not entirely convinced that we've got the time order clearly established. Does the predictor occur before the criterion variables? Again, not entirely clear. Is reverse time order possible? That's an interesting question here. I think the answer is no. I don't think it makes sense to say that opioid use comes before early childhood abuse. I just don't think that order, or certainly causal order, makes sense. Could other variables account for the relationship? Yes, again, authors accounted for some of them, the parental variables, but also I think the effects of childhood trauma on memory, particularly memory of childhood abuse, could relate to opioid use. And actually, it could go in the other direction, though, that severe childhood trauma could lead to underreporting of childhood abuse, suppression of those memories, and at the same time could lead to increased likelihood of opioid use, which some people might refer to as self-medication. So it's possible that the relationship between childhood traumatic abuse in childhood and opioid use is more complicated than suggested here. Uncertainty is relevant, and they deal with that well. So, conclusions. Are the conclusions supported by sound logic? Well, I said yes, because I think that the rationale for looking at these associations is clear. It makes sense to look at childhood abuse in relation to opioid use. It makes sense that they controlled for other demographic variables in this analysis. And they didn't over-interpret the data. They didn't claim that these were predictions, which is a good thing because time order is not clear. They're looking at associations between two things reported at roughly the same time. That's fine. Are the conclusions supported by credible evidence? I'm not sure. I'm not confident in the reliability and validity of these measures. I think that lots of other explanations are possible. Are relevant comparisons available? Mostly, but I'm not entirely sure. I would have liked to have seen associations between continuous measures of abuse. For example, how many times the young person said that he or she had been abused, and opioid use. That would be interesting. And yes, other explanations are possible. Some of these have been provided, and the idea that these associations could be due to third variables is well established here in this article. Okay, so that's it for me. Be interested to hear what you think about this article, and I look forward to seeing you soon.